Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Sleepless Campfire. Tonight, we travel into the forgotten backroads of Florida, places where the humid air grows thick, and what remains are stories that refuse to die. Across these swamps, bayous, and forgotten waterways are accounts drawn from ranger reports, witness statements, and archived broadcasts. Each one verified, recorded, and retold in their own words. The Florida Everglades, a sprawling wetland ecosystem covering nearly 2 million acres, has long been a place of natural wonder and profound mystery. Within this vast wilderness lies Route 41, a highway that cuts through the heart of the swamp, serving as both a lifeline and a boundary between civilization and the untamed wild. Along this stretch and in the uncharted territories beyond, park rangers have encountered phenomena that defy explanation. These are not tales told around campfires for entertainment. These are documented encounters filed in official reports, whispered among ranger stations, and carried in the memories of those who patrol these waters. The stories we will explore tonight span decades, yet they share common threads of isolation, strange occurrences, and encounters with something that may exist beyond our understanding. The Everglades has always been a place of extremes, extreme heat, extreme humidity, extreme biodiversity. But beneath the surface of this natural world lies something else entirely. Something that manifests in the darkness, in the silence between radio calls, and in the spaces where maps end. The rangers who work in this environment are trained professionals, well-versed in survival, navigation, and natural observation. They are not prone to exaggeration or fanciful tales. Yet their reports tell of encounters that have left them questioning the boundaries of reality. Now, let us begin with our first story. In the spring of 1998, Ranger Daniel Mitchell was assigned to the Everglades National Park's western section, a remote area accessible only by boat or helicopter. At 32 years old, Mitchell had been with the Park Service for 8 years, having transferred from Yellowstone seeking warmer climates. He was known among his colleagues for his meticulous record-keeping and unflappable demeanor in crisis situations. The Everglades in March presents a deceptive tranquility. The oppressive heat of summer has yet to arrive, and the water levels are manageable after the dry winter months. Mitchell's patrol route took him through a maze of mangrove tunnels and open sawgrass prairies, an area known locally as the Whispering Reeds, for the sound created when wind passes through the dense vegetation. On March 17th, Mitchell began his routine 5-day patrol, checking remote monitoring stations and documenting wildlife activity. His first 2 days proceeded without incident. The swamp was alive with the usual chorus of bird calls, insect buzzes, and the occasional splash of an alligator sliding into the water. Mitchell logged his coordinates at regular intervals, maintaining radio contact with the ranger station every 12 hours. The trouble began on the evening of March 19th. As Mitchell prepared to make camp on a slightly elevated patch of land called Gator Point, he noticed something unusual. The normal sounds of the swamp had grown uncharacteristically quiet. Even the insects, whose constant chirping formed the backdrop of Everglades nights, had fallen silent. In his official report, filed later, Mitchell wrote, "The silence was profound. Not the natural quiet that comes with a predator's presence, but something else entirely. It felt as though the swamp was holding its breath." As darkness fell, Mitchell secured his small camp and prepared his evening meal. Around 8:30 p.m., as he cleaned his cooking utensils, he heard the first whisper. It sounded like human speech, but too soft to distinguish words. Mitchell attributed it to the wind passing through the reeds, which gave the area its name. By 9:45 p.m., the whispers had grown more distinct. Mitchell later described them as conversational in tone, but without discernible language or pattern. He conducted a perimeter check with his flashlight, finding nothing unusual. The whispers seemed to come from multiple directions, sometimes close, sometimes distant. At 10:30 p.m., Mitchell made his scheduled radio contact with the ranger station. He mentioned the unusual sounds, but downplayed their significance. Probably just the acoustics playing tricks in these reeds, he told the dispatcher. Everything else is normal. What happened next remains one of the most perplexing cases in Everglades National Park history. After signing off from his radio call, Mitchell returned to his tent. Approximately 20 minutes later, he heard what he described as a conversation between multiple voices just outside his tent. The voices were clear enough that he initially believed other campers had arrived, despite the remoteness of his location. "I could hear 3 distinct voices," Mitchell stated in his official testimony. They were speaking in what sounded like a mix of English and something else, perhaps Seminole or another native language. They were discussing something about the water and the moon cycle. When Mitchell called out with his flashlight, the voices immediately ceased. A thorough search of the area revealed no footprints other than his own, no disturbance of vegetation, and no evidence of any other persons. The swamp had returned to its profound silence. The following morning, Mitchell discovered something that would forever change his understanding of the natural world. Near the edge of the water, approximately 50 feet from his campsite, was a series of impressions in the mud. They were not human footprints, nor did they match any known animal tracks in the area. The impressions were elongated, approximately 14 inches in length, with what appeared to be 3 toe-like depressions at the front. What disturbed Mitchell most was the arrangement of the tracks. They formed a perfect circle around his campsite, as though whatever had made them had walked around him while he slept. The tracks led to the water's edge and disappeared. Mitchell photographed the tracks, collected measurements, and immediately radioed the ranger station to report his findings. By that afternoon, 2 additional rangers arrived by helicopter to investigate. They confirmed the unusual nature of the tracks, but could offer no explanation for their origin. The case was officially documented as unidentified track impressions and filed away. Mitchell completed his patrol, but requested a transfer to a different section of the park 6 months later. In a private conversation with a colleague, he admitted that he could no longer patrol the area known as the Whispering Reeds without feeling an overwhelming sense of being watched. Years later, during a retirement interview, Mitchell reflected on that night. "I've spent my life in the wilderness. I know animal behavior, and I know how people interact with natural spaces. What I experienced that night was neither. I don't know what those voices were or what made those tracks, but I know they were real, and I know they were aware of me." The Whispering Reeds remains an active patrol area, though rangers report that some still request assignments elsewhere when that section comes up in the rotation. The official report remains open, with no conclusive explanation ever reached. The history of strange encounters along Route 41 stretches back decades, with perhaps none more perplexing than the disappearance of Ranger Sarah Jenkins in the autumn of 2004. Jenkins had been with the Florida Park Service for 3 years, specializing in botany and wetland ecology. Her expertise in rare orchids made her particularly valuable to the Everglades research team. On October 28th, Jenkins set out alone to document a rare species of ghost orchid that had been reported blooming in a remote area accessible via Loop Road, a spur that branches off from Route 41 and winds through the Big Cypress National Preserve. The orchid in question, Dendrophylax lindeni, is one of the rarest in North America, known for its ethereal white flowers that appear to float in midair. Jenkins was well prepared for the journey, She carried sufficient supplies for 3 days, including emergency rations, a satellite phone, GPS equipment, and her research materials. Her husband, also a park ranger, expected her return on October 31st. When she failed to appear or make contact by November 1st, a search was initiated. What makes Jenkins's disappearance particularly disturbing is the series of radio communications that were partially logged in the hours before she vanished. The first unusual transmission came at approximately 2:17 p.m. on October 29th. The dispatcher recorded it as, "Sarah checking in. I found the orchids, but there's something else here. The water, something's wrong with the water." When asked to clarify, Jenkins's response was cut off by static, though the dispatcher noted what sounded like splashing in the background. The next transmission came at 4:42 p.m. This time, Jenkins's voice was described as agitated and breathless. "I need to document this," she said. "The patterns, they're not natural. They're geometric. Perfect circles in the water expanding outward. No animal makes patterns like these. And the sound, it's like bells, but underwater." Again, the transmission was cut short by what the dispatcher described as unusual interference, unlike any atmospheric disturbance I've encountered. The final communication from Jenkins came at 6:28 p.m. as darkness was falling. Her voice was barely audible over what sounded like whispering or chanting in the background. "They're real," she whispered. "The old stories were true. The water people. They're here. I've seen them." After that, only static was heard on her frequency. The search that followed was one of the most extensive in Florida Park Service history. Over 50 rangers, volunteers, and law enforcement officers combed the area where Jenkins was believed to have been. On November 3rd, they found her campsite. What they discovered baffled everyone involved. Jenkins' tent was still standing, though the entrance flap was wide open. Inside, everything appeared undisturbed. Her research notes were neatly arranged, her camera equipment was intact, and her emergency supplies remained untouched. The only thing missing was her satellite phone and GPS unit. More puzzling was what they found near the water's edge, approximately 50 feet from her camp. Several circular patterns, each approximately 6 feet in diameter, were pressed into the mud. These formations were geometrically precise, with radiating lines extending outward like spokes on a wheel. In the center of each circle, the water appeared to have an unusual quality described by searchers as unusually clear and still, even as the surrounding water moved. Perhaps most disturbing were Jenkins's research notes, which were found open on her field table. The final entry, written in a shaky hand, Kreorf. The patterns appear at dusk. They form in the mud and then fill with water. Something rises from them figures, tall and slender with limbs too long to be human. They move beneath the surface, creating those perfect circles. When I tried to photograph them, my equipment malfunctioned. The last time I saw them clearly, one turned and looked directly at me. Its face, it had no features, just smooth skin where eyes and mouth should be. The search continued for 2 weeks, with divers exploring the deeper channels of the swamp and helicopters conducting aerial surveys. No trace of Jenkins was ever found. Her case remains open with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, listed as missing circumstances unknown. Several months after her disappearance, a group of botanists visiting the area made a disturbing discovery. Near Jenkins's abandoned campsite, they found several ghost orchids growing in an unusual formation, a perfect circle with a radius of approximately 10 feet. Botanists could not explain how these rare plants, which typically grow sporadically and require highly specific conditions, had arranged themselves in such a precise pattern. In the years since Jenkins's disappearance, Other rangers patrolling the Loop Road area have reported unusual phenomena. Some describe seeing circular patterns form spontaneously on the water's surface at dusk. Others mention hearing what sounds like distant bells or chimes, particularly on calm evenings. Most notable are the occasional reports of tall, slender figures seen moving beneath the water's surface, visible only when the light hits at just the right angle. The Seminole and Miccosukee people, who have inhabited the Everglades for centuries, have long spoken of water spirits known as Hataki, which translates roughly to those who walk beneath. According to tribal elders, these entities rarely interact with humans, but are known to occasionally take those who show disrespect to the waters. Jenkins' husband, who retired from the Park Service in 2015, has never spoken publicly about the details of his wife's disappearance. However, in a private conversation with a former colleague, he admitted, "Sarah wasn't disrespectful to the swamp. She loved it more than anyone I've ever known. Maybe that's why they took her. Maybe they wanted to keep her." To this day, rangers patrolling the Loop Road section off Route 41 approach the area with a mixture of scientific curiosity and profound caution. The ghost orchids still bloom in that remote section of the swamp, sometimes in circular patterns that defy botanical explanation. And on quiet evenings, when the water is still, some claim to hear the faint sound of bells chiming from beneath the surface. The Everglades presents unique challenges for radio communication. Dense vegetation, high humidity, and vast expanses of water often interfere with even the most powerful transmission systems. Park rangers have developed specialized protocols for maintaining contact in these conditions, including repeater stations strategically placed throughout the swamp and scheduled check-in times. Despite these precautions, sometimes communications fail for reasons that cannot be technically explained. Such was the case on the night of November 5, 2011, when Ranger Thomas Rodriguez and his partner, Ranger Maria Santos, were conducting a routine patrol in the remote western section of the park, accessible only via a maintenance road that branched off Route 41 near the Fakahatchee Strand Preserve. Rodriguez, a veteran ranger with 15 years of experience in the Everglades, and Santos, who had joined the service 2 years earlier, were documenting water levels and wildlife activity as part of a long-term climate impact study. Their assignment required them to visit several remote monitoring stations over a 3-day period. Their first day proceeded normally. They collected data from 2 stations and made camp as darkness fell. The evening of November 4th was unremarkable, with Rodriguez noting in his log, "Typical Everglades night. Heavy insect chorus, occasional alligator bellowing, clear skies. No issues with equipment or communications." The following morning, they broke camp and proceeded to the 3rd monitoring station, located in a particularly isolated area known as the Stillness among rangers, for the unusual quiet that often pervades the region. The name proved prophetic on this day. As they approached the monitoring station around 10:30 a.m., both rangers noticed that their handheld radios were experiencing unusual interference. Not the usual static or signal fade, Rodriguez later reported. This was different organized patterns of static, almost like a rhythm. When we stopped the vehicle, the pattern became more distinct, almost musical. Santos, who had a background in electrical engineering before joining the Park Service, attempted to diagnose the problem. "I checked all the equipment, ran diagnostics, even tried different frequencies. Everything appeared to be functioning correctly, yet the interference persisted." What happened next would challenge their understanding of radio technology and natural phenomena. As they worked at the monitoring station, both rangers began to hear what they described as faint voices within the static patterns. At first, they dismissed this as auditory pareidolia, the human tendency to perceive patterns in random stimuli. But as the day progressed, the voices became more distinct. Rodriguez documented the experience in his official report. Approximately 1420 hours, while recording water temperature data, both Rangers Santos and I clearly heard what sounded like a child's voice coming through the radio, despite our frequency being set to the official Park Service channel. The voice seemed to be singing a simple melody, though the words were indistinct. The Rangers attempted to locate the source of the transmission, believing it might be coming from an unauthorized broadcaster or a lost hiker. They drove in the direction from which the signal seemed strongest, but found no evidence of other people in the area. The strange singing continued intermittently throughout the afternoon. By dusk, the nature of the radio interference had changed again. The singing had ceased, replaced by what both Rangers described as conversational voices in an unknown language. Rodriguez noted in his log, "The voices seemed to be speaking in turns, as though engaged in a dialogue. The pattern was too regular to be random static, yet we could not identify the language or dialect." As night fell, the Rangers made camp and established a watch schedule. Around 9:30 p.m., while Santos was on watch, the radio suddenly emitted a clear, undistorted voice speaking in English. "They know you're here," the voice said. "They're watching from the water." Santos immediately woke Rodriguez, who listened as the voice continued. "The lights you see aren't lightning. They're hunting. Don't go near the water after dark." When Rodriguez attempted to respond, the voice vanished, replaced by the now familiar patterned static. For the next hour, the Rangers monitored the radio, hearing only the rhythmic interference and occasional fragments of what sounded like the same unknown language they had heard earlier. The following morning, they discovered something that would forever alter their perception of the swamp. Near their campsite, approximately 20 feet from their tents, were a series of unusual tracks in the damp earth. The tracks were unlike anything either Ranger had seen before long. Narrow impressions with what appeared to be 3 toes or prongs at the front, arranged in a pattern that suggested a bipedal creature with a stride of approximately 6 feet. What disturbed Rodriguez most was the direction of the tracks. They approached our campsite, circled it once, then returned to the water's edge, he later testified. There was no sign of what made them, but the ground was too compacted for the tracks to be more than a few hours old. The Rangers documented the tracks with photographs and measurements, then quickly packed their equipment and departed the area. As they drove away, both noticed unusual lights flickering beneath the water's surface in the distance. Rodriguez described them as pale blue orbs that moved independently of each other, sometimes rising to the surface before sinking again. When they returned to the ranger station and reported their experiences, they were initially met with skepticism. However, when their radio equipment was examined by communication specialists, they found no evidence of malfunction or tampering. The patterned static they had recorded could not be explained by any known natural or technological phenomenon. Perhaps most puzzling was the analysis of the recording of the English voice. Audio experts confirmed that the recording was genuine and had not been fabricated. However, they could not determine the origin of the transmission, which seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously. In the years since this incident, other rangers patrolling the area known as the Stillness have reported similar experiences. Some describe hearing singing or conversational voices in their radios, even when the equipment is turned off. Others mention seeing strange lights beneath the water's surface or discovering unusual tracks near their campsites. The official explanation remains unidentified radio interference, though many rangers who have worked in that section of the Everglades believe there is something more at play. As Rodriguez noted in a private conversation with a colleague, "I've spent my career studying the natural world, But what we experienced that day defied natural explanation. The swamp holds secrets that science has yet to uncover. To this day, rangers assigned to patrol the remote western section off Route 41 approach their duties with a mixture of scientific curiosity and unspoken apprehension. The monitoring stations continue to collect data on water levels and wildlife activity, documenting the natural rhythms of the Everglades. But sometimes, in the silence between official transmissions, those who listen carefully claim to hear something else, patterns in the static that suggest an intelligence as ancient and mysterious as the swamp itself. In the vast expanse of the Everglades, where the boundaries between land and water blur into an indistinguishable horizon, some encounters leave behind tangible evidence that defies conventional explanation. Such was the case in the winter of 2016, when wildlife photographer and part-time park volunteer Elena Rodriguez captured a series of images that would become one of the most debated pieces of evidence in the annals of Everglades strange encounters. Rodriguez, a 35-year-old Miami native with a master's degree in wildlife biology, had been volunteering with the Park Service for 3 years. Her specialty was nocturnal photography, particularly capturing the elusive behavior of crocodilians and other swamp creatures under cover of darkness. Her work had been featured in several nature publications, and her technical expertise with specialized camera equipment made her a valuable asset to the research team. On January 17th, Rodriguez set out alone to photograph the nesting behavior of American crocodiles in a remote area, accessible via a dirt road that branched off Route 41 near the Shark Valley Visitor Center. She had received special permission for nighttime access to this restricted area, which was known to support a significant population of the threatened species. Rodriguez was well equipped for her expedition. She carried professional-grade cameras with night vision capabilities, motion sensors, and remote triggers. Her goal was to capture a complete cycle of crocodile nesting behavior over a 48-hour period. She established a concealed observation post approximately 50 feet from a known nesting site, camouflaged with native vegetation. The first 24 hours proceeded as expected. Rodriguez captured hundreds of images of the nesting crocodile, documenting its protective behaviors and interactions with other wildlife. Her motion sensors recorded the comings and goings of various swamp creatures throughout the day and night. The unusual activity began around 2:17 a.m. on January 19th. Rodriguez was reviewing her images when she noticed something odd in several frames taken at approximately 1:45 a.m. In the background, behind the nesting crocodile, stood a tall, slender figure that did not match any known animal in the region. At first, Rodriguez believed it might be a poacher or another unauthorized person in the restricted area. She carefully scanned the surroundings with her night vision equipment, but found no one. The figure in her photographs appeared to be approximately 8 feet tall, with an unusually thin build and limbs that seemed disproportionate to its torso. What puzzled Rodriguez most was the figure's apparent proximity to the nesting crocodile. In her experience, crocodiles were fiercely protective of their nests and would typically drive away any potential threats. Yet this creature stood unmoving just 15 feet from the nest, with the crocodile showing no signs of agitation. Over the next hour, Rodriguez captured several more images of the figure. Each time, it appeared in a slightly different position, though never moving far from the nesting site. When she reviewed the images in sequence, she noticed that the figures seemed to be observing the crocodile's behavior with what appeared to be scientific interest. Around 3:30 a.m., Rodriguez decided to investigate more closely. She left her observation post and approached the nesting site, moving as quietly as possible in the humid darkness. As she drew closer, she noticed that the air around the nest felt unusually cold, despite the typical warmth of Everglades nights. When she reached the area where she had seen the figure, She found nothing but disturbed vegetation and several unusual tracks in the damp earth. The tracks were similar to those reported in other Everglades encounters, elongated impressions with 3 toe-like depressions at the front. What distinguished these tracks was their arrangement. They formed a perfect semicircle around the crocodile's nest, as though whatever had made them had been studying it from multiple angles. Rodriguez photographed the tracks and collected soil samples for analysis. As she worked, she became aware of a faint sound, what she described as a low, resonant hum that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. The sound was not mechanical or animal in nature, but rather something she could not identify with her extensive knowledge of natural swamp sounds. The most disturbing incident occurred around 4:45 a.m. as Rodriguez was returning to her observation post. As she passed a cluster of mangrove trees, she heard what sounded like whispering in an unknown language. The voices seemed to come from the trees themselves, though she could see no one. When she aimed her camera toward the sound, the night vision display flickered with what appeared to be multiple tall, slender figures moving between the trees. The figures were bipedal, but moved with an unusual gait too fluid to be human, yet too deliberate to be animal. Rodriguez managed to capture several photographs of these figures before her equipment suddenly malfunctioned. All her cameras shut down simultaneously, despite having fresh batteries. Even her backup equipment failed to operate. At this point, Rodriguez decided to abandon her post and return to the main road. As she gathered her equipment, she noticed that the humming sound had grown louder, and the whispering voices seemed to be all around her. The air had grown noticeably colder, and she observed what appeared to be faint blue lights flickering between the trees. Rodriguez left the area as quickly as possible, driving back to the ranger station where she reported her experiences to the night duty officer. Initially, her account was met with skepticism, but when she presented her photographs and the soil samples she had collected, the attitude changed. The photographs, when examined by experts, proved genuinely puzzling. The tall figure captured near the crocodile nest showed no signs of digital manipulation. Multiple imaging specialists confirmed that the images were authentic and unaltered. Even more intriguing were thermal images that showed the figure to be significantly cooler than its surroundings, with a body temperature approximately 20 degrees lower than the ambient air temperature. The soil samples revealed traces of an unknown organic compound that did not match any plant or animal material found in the Everglades. Microscopic analysis showed structures that appeared cellular but did not correspond to any known biological classification. In the weeks following Rodriguez's encounter, other rangers and researchers reported unusual phenomena in the same area. Some described hearing whispering voices or seeing tall figures moving at the edge of their vision. Others mentioned equipment malfunctions or unusual temperature fluctuations. The official investigation into Rodriguez's photographs and evidence remains open, classified as unidentified biological phenomena. The images have been analyzed by numerous experts, none of whom could provide a conventional explanation for what they depict. Rodriguez, deeply affected by her experience, continued her work with the Park Service, but specialized in daytime photography thereafter. In a later interview, she reflected on her encounter. "I've spent my life studying wildlife, and I can tell you with certainty that what I saw that night was not any known animal. It was something else entirely, something that has learned to exist alongside us in the swamp, observing us as we observe the creatures around us." The photographs remain in the archives of the Everglades Research Center, accessible only to authorized personnel. Occasionally, researchers studying them report feeling watched or experiencing unexplained technical difficulties with their equipment while examining the images. To this day, the area off Route 41 where Rodriguez had her encounter continues to be a site of unusual phenomena. Rangers patrolling the region sometimes report seeing tall figures at the edge of their vision or hearing whispering voices when no one is nearby. Most keep these experiences to themselves, knowing that the official explanation remains unidentified and that the swamp holds secrets that may never be fully understood. The Everglades has always been a place of contrasts, beautiful yet dangerous, life-giving yet treacherous. Nowhere is this duality more apparent than in the stories of encounters with what some rangers have come to call the children of the water. Entities that appear as children, but possess characteristics that defy human explanation. One of the most detailed accounts of such encounters comes from Ranger Michael Torres, who experienced a series of strange events during the summer of 2018. While patrolling a remote section of the swamp accessible via a maintenance road off Route 41 near the Ochapi Post Office. Torres, a 42-year-old former Marine with 12 years of experience in the Park Service, had developed a reputation for his level-headed approach to unusual situations. He was known among his colleagues for his practicality and skepticism regarding paranormal phenomena, making his detailed account of the events that summer particularly compelling. The encounters began on June 3, 2018, as Torres was conducting a routine inspection of remote water monitoring stations in an area known as the Nursery among park staff. The name referred to the high concentration of juvenile wildlife in the region, particularly alligators and wading birds, that use the shallow waters as a safe haven from predators. As Torres approached the first monitoring station around 10:30 a.m., he noticed what appeared to be 3 children playing near the water's edge, approximately 200 yards away. Given the remote location, this was unusual but not impossible. The area was occasionally visited by the children of local fishermen or Seminole families who maintained traditional hunting grounds in the swamp. Torres noted their presence in his log and continued with his work. Approximately 30 minutes later, as he was calibrating the monitoring equipment, he heard what sounded like children laughing nearby. When he looked up, the children were much closer, perhaps 50 yards away, and appeared to be splashing in the shallow water. What struck Torres as odd was their appearance. Even from a distance, he could see that their movements were unusually fluid, almost as though they were part of the water itself. Their laughter, while childlike, had an unusual quality, a resonance that seemed to carry further than normal human voices. When Torres called out to them, asking if their parents were nearby, the children immediately stopped playing and turned to face him. It was at this moment that he realized something was profoundly wrong. They looked like children, but not like any children I've ever seen, Torres later reported. Their eyes were too large, black and depthless. Their skin had a pale, almost translucent quality that seemed to shimmer in the sunlight. And when they moved, it was with an unnatural grace, too smooth, too fluid to be human. As Torres watched, one of the children raised a hand and waved slowly. The gesture was almost normal, except that the child's fingers appeared slightly longer and more slender than typical human proportions. When Torres took a step toward them, the children turned and moved toward deeper water. What happened next defied Torres's understanding of human capability. The children did not swim, but rather appeared to merge with the water itself, disappearing beneath the surface without creating the typical splashing or disturbance that Torres would expect from people entering the water. Torres approached the area where the children had vanished, finding no footprints or other evidence of their presence besides disturbed water. He radioed the ranger station to report the unusual encounter, describing it as possible unauthorized minors in restricted area. The following day, as Torres continued his patrol, he experienced another encounter. This time, he was near a different monitoring station when he heard what sounded like a child crying. The sound seemed to come from a dense cluster of mangroves approximately 50 yards from his position. Concerned that a child might be lost or injured, Torres approached cautiously. As he drew closer, he could see a small figure sitting at the base of one of the trees. The child appeared to be approximately 6 or 7 years old, with pale skin and dark hair. When Torres called out, asking if the child needed help, the crying stopped abruptly. The child looked up, revealing the same unnaturally large, dark eyes that Torres had seen the previous day. Unlike the other children, this one remained motionless, watching Torres with an expression that he later described as curious but devoid of emotion. As Torres approached slowly, the child stood and moved backward into the shadows between the trees. Torres followed, finding himself in a small clearing where the mangrove roots formed a natural shelter. The child was nowhere to be seen, but Torres noticed something unusual, a series of circular patterns pressed into the damp earth, each approximately 3 feet in diameter. The patterns were geometrically precise, with radiating lines extending outward like spokes on a wheel. In the center of each circle, the vegetation appeared to grow in a spiral pattern, rather than the random arrangement typical of natural growth. Torres photographed the patterns and collected soil samples for analysis. As he worked, he became aware of a faint sound, what he described as a low, resonant humming that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. The sound was not mechanical or animal in nature, but rather something he could not identify with his extensive knowledge of natural swamp sounds. The most disturbing incident occurred 2 days later, as Torres was preparing to conclude his patrol and return to the main road. Around 4:30 p.m., as he was loading his equipment, he heard what sounded like children whispering nearby. When he looked up, he saw 3 of the pale-eyed children standing at the edge of the clearing, watching him silently, unlike his previous encounters. This time, the children did not flee when he noticed them. Instead, they stood motionless, observing him with their unnervingly large eyes. After several minutes of this silent observation, one of the children stepped forward and spoke in a voice that Torres described as like multiple people speaking at once. "You should not stay here after dark," the child said. "The water does not like strangers when the moon is full." Before Torres could respond, all 3 children turned and walked, the child said. "The water does not like strangers when the moon is full." Before Torres could respond, all 3 children turned and walked toward the water. As before, they did not swim, but seemed to merge with the swamp, disappearing beneath the surface without a ripple. Torres stood frozen for several moments, processing what he had just witnessed. This was no trick of the light or a case of mistaken identity. He had spoken with one of them. Torres decided to cut his patrol short. As he quickly packed his equipment, he noticed the air had grown cooler and the usual sounds of the swamp had diminished. An unnatural silence was falling over the nursery. He felt a profound sense of unease, the kind of primal fear that transcends rational thought. He was being watched, not by a predator, but by something intelligent and ancient. He radioed the ranger station, reporting that he was concluding his patrol early due to unforeseen circumstances. He did not elaborate on his encounters, knowing how it would sound. When the dispatcher asked if he needed assistance, Torres declined, simply stating he was eager to get back to base. As he drove down the bumpy maintenance road toward Route 41, Torres kept checking his rearview mirrors. Several times, he thought he saw pale figures standing at the edge of the tree line. But when he looked again, they were gone. The last mile of the road was the most unnerving. The swamp on both sides seemed to press in on him, the shadows lengthening even though the sun had not yet set. When Torres finally reached the paved highway, he felt an overwhelming sense of relief. He pulled over, got out of his vehicle, and took a deep breath. The air here felt different, normal. He looked back toward the swamp, at the wall of green vegetation that hid its secrets. For a moment, he thought he saw 3 small figures standing at the edge of the road, watching him leave. He blinked, and they were gone. Torres filed a detailed report upon his return, but he omitted the most extraordinary details, including the conversation with the child. He described seeing unidentified juveniles and noted their unusual appearance, but framed it as a possible encounter with the children of local inhabitants, despite the remoteness of the location. He did, however, include his photographs of the circular patterns and the soil samples he had collected. The official analysis of the soil samples revealed traces of an unknown biological material, similar to findings from other unexplained incidents in the Everglades. The photographs of the patterns were cataloged, but no definitive explanation was offered. Torres' official report was filed under unidentified person sighting and eventually archived. In private conversations with trusted colleagues, Torres shared the full story of his encounters. He admitted that what he had experienced had fundamentally changed his perception of the Everglades. "I always thought I knew this swamp," he told one fellow ranger. "I studied its ecosystems, its patterns, its dangers. But what I met out there, they're not part of the ecosystem. They are the swamp, or at least a part of it that we have no names for." Torres continued to work for the Park Service, but he never again requested a patrol in the section known as the Nursery. Other rangers who patrolled that area occasionally reported similar sightings, pale-eyed children who appeared and disappeared near the water's edge. Circular patterns pressed into the mud, and areas of profound, unnatural silence. The Seminole and Miccosukee people have long spoken of water spirits that sometimes take the form of children to lure or communicate with humans. According to tribal elders, these entities are neither benevolent nor malevolent, but rather forces of nature that should be treated with respect and caution. They are the guardians of the water, the original inhabitants of the River of Grass. Torres' encounter remains one of the most detailed and credible accounts of these so-called children of the water. His reputation as a level-headed and experienced ranger lends significant weight to his testimony. He saw what he saw, and it defies all conventional explanation. The Everglades holds many secrets, but perhaps none are as unsettling as the possibility that within its murky waters and shadowed mangroves, there exist entities that mimic the form of children, watching from the depths with ancient, knowing eyes. No trace of the children was ever found, other than the patterns in the mud and the lingering fear in those who saw them. The vastness of the Everglades means that park rangers often serve as first responders to medical emergencies, not only for other rangers and visitors, but also for the small communities scattered throughout the region. These calls are typically routine heat exhaustion, minor injuries, or occasionally more serious incidents like alligator attacks. But in the early hours of March 22, 2015, paramedics and rangers responded to a call that would challenge their understanding of emergency medicine and the very nature of the swamp environment they served. The call came in at 3:17 a.m. It was a garbled transmission on the emergency frequency, reportedly from a small fishing camp in a remote area called Cypress Cove, accessible only by a narrow, unmarked channel off Route 41. The dispatcher could make out only a few words. "Help. My son, not breathing. Something in the water." Due to the remote location and difficulty of nighttime navigation in the swamp, a ranger boat was dispatched first to assess the situation, followed by an airboat paramedic unit. Ranger David Chen, a former paramedic with 10 years of experience in the Everglades, was the first to arrive on scene. What Chen found at the camp was deeply disturbing. A man, later identified as 48-year-old fisherman John Willis, was kneeling beside a small tent, frantically performing CPR on a young boy. Willis was hysterical, his words a mixture of prayers and panicked explanations. "It got him," Willis kept repeating. "It came out of the water and it got him." Chen immediately took over CPR while trying to calm Willis and get more information. The boy, Willis's 7-year-old son Samuel, was unresponsive, his skin cold and clammy despite the humid night air. Chen noted that the boy's lips had a faint blue tinge, but there were no obvious signs of drowning, such as water in the lungs or foam around the mouth. "He wasn't in the water," Willis explained, his voice trembling. "We were sleeping. I heard a splash, and when I looked out, Samuel was standing by the fire. He was just staring at the water. Then he fell. When the paramedic unit arrived 20 minutes later, they took over efforts to revive the boy. They worked on him for over 40 minutes, but he was pronounced dead at the scene. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest of unknown etiology. What made this case so unusual were the physical findings and the father's testimony. During the examination, the paramedics noted several strange marks on the boy's arms and legs. They were not scratches or bite marks, but rather a series of thin, red lines, almost like welts, that formed a geometric pattern. The lines were cool to the touch, and the surrounding skin was unnaturally pale. In his official statement, John Willis described the events of that night. He and his son had arrived at Cypress Cove that afternoon for a weekend fishing trip. They set up camp, cooked dinner, and went to bed around 10 p.m. Willis was awakened around 3 a.m. by a strange sound. It was like a whisper, but it came from the water, Willis stated. Then I heard a splash. I thought Samuel had fallen in, so I ran out of the tent. But he was just standing there by the edge of the water, looking at something. I called his name, but he didn't answer. Willis said that when he approached his son, he noticed the air around the boy felt unusually cold. It was like standing in front of an open freezer, he recalled. Samuel was just staring at the water, and I could see these shapes moving beneath the surface. They were long and dark, and they were glowing with a faint blue light. According to Willis, one of the shapes rose to the surface. He described it as a long, pale arm with too many joints. It reached out of the water and touched his son's leg. Samuel cried out once, then collapsed. When I ran to him, he wasn't breathing. Willis said, his voice breaking. I started CPR, but I knew it was too late. Whatever that thing did, it took something from him. Ranger Chen, who had seen his share of strange things in the Everglades, found Willis's account disturbing, but credible. The man was traumatized. But he wasn't hallucinating, Chen later reported. And those marks on the boy? I've never seen anything like them. They weren't from any animal I know. The investigation into Samuel Willis's death was thorough but inconclusive. The coroner's report confirmed the cause of death as cardiac arrest, but could not explain the underlying trigger. Toxicology reports came back negative for any known poisons or drugs. The marks on the boy's body were photographed and analyzed, but pathologists could not determine their origin. Searches of the area around the campsite found no evidence of any unusual animal activity. There were no tracks other than those of Willis and his son. The water where the shapes were seen appeared normal, with no unusual chemical or biological readings. The case was officially closed as death by natural causes, though many involved, including Ranger Chen, believed this was an inadequate explanation. There was nothing natural about what happened that night. Chen told a colleague, I've seen alligator attacks, I've seen water moccasin bites, I've seen every kind of injury this swamp can inflict. This was different. This was something else. In the years since the incident, Cypress Cove has developed a reputation among local fishermen and rangers as a place to be avoided, especially after dark. Some report seeing strange lights in the water or hearing whispers on the wind. Most notably, there have been other unconfirmed reports of people experiencing sudden, unexplained chills or seeing long, pale shapes moving beneath the surface. The Seminole people have legends of water witches entities that live in the deepest parts of the swamp and can drain the life force from those who disturb their domain. According to these stories, the water witches leave geometric patterns on the skin of their victims, marking them as belonging to the water. John Willis never returned to the Everglades after his son's death. He moved away from Florida, unable to bear the memories of that night. In a letter to Ranger Chen written a year after the incident, he wrote, "I know people think I'm crazy, or that I'm just trying to find something to blame for a tragic accident. But I saw what I saw. Something came out of that water and took my son. It wasn't an animal, and it wasn't a dream. It was real, and it's still out there." The official file on the death of Samuel Willis remains in the archives of the Collier County Sheriff's Office, a case marked by unanswered questions and a father's unshakable conviction that something unnatural lurks in the waters of Cypress Cove. For the rangers who patrol the remote areas off Route 41, it serves as a chilling reminder that the swamp can be not only dangerous, but utterly alien. The Everglades is no stranger to hurricanes. These powerful storms are a natural part of the ecosystem, reshaping the land and waterways with their wind and rain. For park rangers, hurricanes mean evacuation, securing equipment, and hunkering down to wait out the storm. But Hurricane Irma in September of 2017 brought something more than just wind and flooding to one isolated ranger station off Route 41. It brought an encounter that would be recorded in the station's official log as a Category 5 anomaly. Ranger Station 7, located near the Miccosukee Indian Reservation, was manned by 2 rangers during the storm. James Miller, a 50-year-old veteran with over 20 years of service in the Everglades, and his partner, Jessica Alvarez, a relatively new ranger with 5 years of experience. The station was built to withstand hurricanes, with reinforced concrete walls and steel shutters over the windows. Their job was to monitor the storm's impact and report any major breaches or environmental damage. The storm made landfall on September 10th as a Category 4 hurricane. Miller and Alvarez spent the day securing the final equipment and communicating with the regional command center before the storm knocked out all communications. By 6 p.m., they were completely cut off, surrounded by the howling wind and lashing rain. The first 12 hours of the storm proceeded as expected. The building groaned under the force of the wind, and rain pelted the steel shutters like a constant drumbeat. The Rangers kept busy monitoring the storm's progress with their battery-powered equipment and documenting the rising water levels. Around 6 a.m. on September 11th, as the eye of the hurricane passed over their location, something strange happened. The sudden, eerie calm that accompanies the eye of a storm descended upon the station. The wind died down and the rain stopped, but the silence that followed was not peaceful. "It was wrong," Miller later wrote in his log. "The eye of a hurricane is quiet, yes, but not like this." This was a heavy, listening silence. The kind of silence you feel when you're being watched. Alvarez felt it too. "I went to the window and looked out," she reported. "The water had risen to within a few feet of the station. But that's not what I noticed. It was the surface of the water. It was perfectly still. Not a single ripple, despite the wind that had been blowing at over 100 miles an hour just minutes before. As they watched, something even more peculiar occurred. The water around the station began to emit a faint, pulsing blue light. The light seemed to originate from beneath the surface and pulsed in a slow, rhythmic pattern, like a heartbeat. Miller, a man of science and reason, tried to find a logical explanation. Bioluminescent algae were common in the Gulf, but this was different. The light was too organized, too rhythmic, and it was growing brighter. Around 7:30 a.m., with the eye still over their location, Miller and Alvarez heard a sound. It was not the wind or the rain, but a low, resonant hum that seemed to come from the water itself. The hum was in perfect sync with the pulsing light. "I've heard a lot of sounds in this swamp," Miller noted in his log. "I've heard gators bellowing, panthers screaming, wood storks clacking. I've heard the wind whistle through the cypress trees and the rain pound on the tin roof. But I have never heard a sound like this. It was ancient. It was the sound of something very old and very large waking up." As the hum grew louder, Alvarez noticed movement in the water. Shapes, she later described them. Long, dark shapes, bigger than any alligator I've ever seen. They were moving just beneath the surface, circling the station. And they were all glowing with that same blue light. One of the shapes moved closer to the station, stopping just outside the reinforced door. Through the small, reinforced window in the door, Miller and Alvarez could see it clearly. It was not an alligator or a manatee. It was a long, serpentine creature, easily 30 feet in length, with a body that seemed almost translucent. It had no visible eyes or fins, yet it moved with purpose and intelligence. The creature pressed against the steel door of the station. The building shuddered, but the reinforced held. Miller and Alvarez watched in silent terror as the creature's head, if it could be called that, moved back and forth as if testing the door. Then another creature joined it, this one even larger, and another. Soon, there were 5 of these massive, glowing serpents circling the station, their bodies creating a slow, deliberate pattern in the water. The low hum grew louder, resonating through the concrete walls of the station. "They were communicating," Alvarez later stated. "I don't know how I knew, but I could feel it. They were talking to each other, and they were talking to us. They were letting us know that they were there, that this was their world, and we were just visitors." The most terrifying part of the encounter came when one of the creatures rose partially out of the water, revealing a section of its body along the side of the station. Where its body touched the concrete, the wall began to frost over, the condensation freezing into intricate, crystalline patterns. "It was impossible," Miller wrote. "The air temperature was over 80 degrees. The water was warm. But that creature was so cold, it was freezing the concrete. The eye of the hurricane began to pass, and the wind started to pick up again. As the first raindrops began to fall, the creatures seemed to sense the change. One by one, they submerged, the blue light fading with them. The low hum ceased, and the oppressive silence was broken by the returning howl of the wind. The backside of the hurricane was just as ferocious as the front. Miller and Alvarez spent the next 12 hours weathering the storm, but their minds were on what they had witnessed during the eye. They didn't speak of it, but they both knew they had seen something that defied all explanation. When the storm finally passed and communications were restored, they reported their experience. The official response was one of disbelief, but the evidence they had collected was compelling. They had photographs of the frozen patterns on the wall, and their audio recordings of the low hum were analyzed by experts who could not identify the source. The official report, filed under Unidentified Marine Phenomena, remains open. The frozen patterns on the wall of Ranger Station 7 were documented and photographed before they melted. But samples of the crystalline structure were collected and sent for analysis. The results were inconclusive, showing traces of unknown minerals and organic compounds. Miller retired from the Park Service a year later. In a farewell letter to his colleagues, he wrote, "I have spent my life studying and protecting the Everglades. I thought I knew its secrets. But what we saw during the Eye of Irma, it showed me how little we really know. There are things in this swamp, things that have been here long before us and will be here long after we're gone. We are not the masters of this domain. We are merely guests, and sometimes the hosts make themselves known." Alvarez continues to work for the Park Service, but she requested a transfer to a different section of the Everglades. She still has nightmares about the glowing serpents and the sound of their ancient, resonant hum. She knows that somewhere in the deepest, most remote parts of the swamp, those creatures still exist, waiting for the next storm to reveal their presence. The American landscape remains vast and unknowable, but perhaps nowhere is this more true than in the Florida Everglades. This river of grass, a world of water and shadow, holds secrets that defy our understanding of the natural world. The stories we have explored tonight, drawn from the official logs and first-hand accounts of those who patrol its remote expanses, are not tales of fiction. They are documented encounters with phenomena that linger at the edge of our perception. From the whispering reeds that speak in forgotten tongues, to the vanished rangers taken by the water's silent grasp. From the radio transmissions that carry voices from unknown sources, to the photographs that capture what should not exist. From the pale-eyed children who emerge from the depths, to the ancient serpents revealed in the eye of the storm. And from the final, desperate words of a man lost to a darkness he could not name. These accounts share a common thread of silence and absence. The answers are not found in conclusive evidence or scientific explanation, but in the quiet spaces left behind, in the tracks that lead to the water's edge and go no further, in the static that forms patterns on the radio, in the cold spots where the air grows heavy and the natural world holds its breath. The true horror in these stories is not the monster in the closet, but the unsettling realization that we are not always the dominant species, that there are forces at work in the wild places of this country that are ancient, patient, and beyond our comprehension. The rangers who work off Route 41 and in other remote corners of the Everglades are trained observers, men and women who know the land and its creatures better than most. Yet their experiences remind us that even the most knowledgeable among us can encounter something that shatters their worldview. They are the front-line witnesses to a world that is not entirely mapped, a reality that has layers we have only begun to perceive. The motifs that recur throughout these encounters, the radio voices, the strange footprints, the objects return to their places. The profound silence are like echoes from a place just beyond our own. They suggest a hidden ecosystem, one that exists alongside our own, occasionally intersecting in moments of terrifying clarity. The swamp is not just a collection of plants and animals. It is an entity, a living, breathing consciousness that has its own rules and its own inhabitants. These stories are not meant to be explanations, but rather documentations. They are a testament to the mysteries that still exist in the modern world, a reminder that there are places where the maps end and the unknown begins. The Everglades is one such place, a realm of water and shadow where the line between the natural and the supernatural is as blurred and indistinct as the horizon at dusk. If you or someone you know has a true story to share, leave it in the comments below. The most compelling accounts are often the quietest ones,